How have the sessions been so far? Has everyone done everything? I've been in and out, so I'm not completely up to speed on the success and failures of the various sessions. This one is particularly close to me, and I'm going to stay for the whole session here, because I think for what I've done in my career, both as a policy advocate and then representing a lot of startups, this is closest to my heart and my sweet spot. And frankly, I look at Nate here and what he's doing, trying to build communities of social entrepreneurs. I think that's exactly where I want my students going. So we've been trying to give as much support to his Goodnik efforts as possible, including trying to morph it into more of a community trade association, speak for the socially responsible entrepreneurs, both domestically and internationally. So the goal is to be as interactive as possible. I don't know if that's been successful in the prior sessions. We are brainstorming here. Our goal, I don't know, Nate doesn't know, Neil doesn't know fully how this can evolve. I've tried to start over the years. I've ran a couple trade associations, including something 8 years ago that we called the Global IP Alliance. It was an effort to bring in all the disparate branches of the burgeoning internet community around the world to create a series of best practices. What are good actors on the internet? How do you behave? And how do we stop all the infighting? And how do we create a system in which we're not all subject to 200 plus government statutes and regulations? Can we prove to governments around the world that we as a community can be responsible actors? So for me, that's the piece where I want to take this. And I specifically had a spoke off of Nate's bigger umbrella that I want to talk about, which is the concept of transparency and openness. What does it mean to be an open corporation? And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to give it over to Nate.
Great. So just to give you some background, Goodnik is a membership-based organization that provides resources for social entrepreneurs. That's one side of things. The other side of what we do is promote social responsibility in the private sector. And so I've been sort of grappling with this issue of what does it mean to be socially responsible, especially in the technology world. And one of the things, and I've gotten pretty far on that, but one of the things that's sort of core to this question is how people use and promote products in the digital space. And I looked at examples like how Facebook has been used for revolutions, Twitter has been used to influence huge political causes. All of these things were unintended results of having a platform that was fairly flexible and fairly open. But if you're going to be a socially responsible technology company and you're going to have a digital product, are there other things that you need to be thinking of, and how do we build that into the product from the beginning, rather than saying, oh, well, now that we've developed Facebook, let's go back and try and tailor it so that it's more open or more accessible or something like that. So that's sort of the problem that I'm grappling with, and just to lay out sort of the framework of the discussion, I put together sort of a little bit of a guideline. One of the things that came to mind was, we have these huge online communities right now. Facebook is on the verge of exceeding China's population. It probably will. The number of Facebook users will probably outnumber the number of people in China sometime by the middle of next year. And so what we have is these sort of countries, virtual countries, that operate under their own rules. And those rules are not subject to anybody. Now, normally, countries are subject to international law. And so when I started thinking about this problem, I thought about the ICCPR, the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, and how important that is for codifying what we consider the core principles of democracy and freedom. And then, now of course the ICCPR only applies to countries, and you can't just say, oh, well, Facebook has to comply. But what if we could write something that was an internet convention for civil and political rights? What if we could create something that was inherent in a company's bylaws or in some other kind of legally enforceable method to encourage them to be better corporate citizens, especially when it came to allowing the use of their product in the right way? So I broke it down, and this is like I said, a work in progress, and I'm looking for more feedback and more input and sort of notes on this, and that's why we're hacking this document today. But I broke it down into sort of 5 major categories: security, liberty, access, interoperability, and transparency. And then at the end, of course, there's the issue of enforcement, which is inherent in any law issue. Security, it comes down to, we've had a lot of talk about privacy. The previous session in this room was about privacy, and that's a really important topic. But there's also a lot of other things that are related to that. Security issues, the sale of data, anonymity, security of your data against hackers, and against government requests that are unlawful. And I think that's a really important topic that we see in issues like when Google gets requests from the Chinese government to release information about their users because the Chinese government wants to persecute them. So how do we build something into a policy within a technology company that says that they're only going to release their data, or they're going to protect your data against hackers, they're not going to sell your data, they're going to release it only to governments who are in compliance with the ICCPR or something like that. There's all of those kinds of issues, I think, come into security. The liberty issues that I identified. Who owns the data? If you're uploading a photo, is it copyright you or is it copyright somebody else? Is there a freedom of platform? Are you allowed to maintain your data from one platform to another? Can you export your data? Can you download it when you want? Can you be protected against the deletion of your account and your data? This is an issue I think that we see a lot with companies that start up and then fail. Companies will go under, and then the data that you may have uploaded, which is critical to you, is gone. It also happens when you stop paying your bill. You may have 1,000 photos on Flickr, but when you stop paying your monthly dues because you can't, you don't want to spend $10 to have online storage anymore. Is there an easy way to access that data and get it back and make sure that it's not deleted just because you didn't pay your bill 1 month? Access to services, I think, is another important issue. It comes down to how companies prepare their products and make sure that everyone has access to them, regardless of their nation of origin, language, ethnicity, religion, all of those sorts of things. There's also some due process issues when it comes to denying access to people based on their behavior online. So, there's no set of standards out there about whether or not a company, how a company goes about banning a user, deleting a user, removing a user's, comments from a site. If there's no consistency in that, there's a real lack of due process in terms of participating in these online communities. And just to take you back again to this idea that Facebook is as big as China, which it's not, but it's 3 times as large as the United States. Let's put it that way. If the nation of Facebook is 3 times larger than the United States, and it decides that it's going to take away your commenting privileges, it's the equivalent of the United States saying, we're taking away your First Amendment rights. And so there's some real issues, I think, that need to be built into product design about making sure that these policies are in place so that there's no capricious removal of users or deletion of data. Interoperability, I think, is another core issue with this. How does the system itself that you're participating in interact with other systems? Is it open? Is it open source? Or is information on it really, open to being copied and used in other ways? Is there an API that can be used to access the service from other digital platforms? These are ideally things that are built into any good product so that you encourage the proper use and responsible use of it. And then there's the fundamental freedoms of expression, association, religion, freedom from hate speech, and freedom of choice of language, which I think are also all things that should be built into any digital product. There need to be policies and tools in place to make sure that people maintain these freedoms when using any kind of platform. Then there are issues of transparency, which Jonathan, I think, can speak to best.
So look, I love all of these angles, so I don't want to pick favorites out of all of the issues, but for me it comes down to how many things can we actually bite off and what can we bite off initially. And I think Nate laid it out all quite well. My objective here is to figure out with the group what we think is most important, how we tackle it, how we might present this as a global initiative, how we might be able to build momentum, create some sort of viral community, such that folks all around the world recognize these as important values, and companies, not governments, companies will try to adhere to a lot of these principles. That's my objective. So for me, the kernel that made the most sense right now grew in my mind out of the concept of the B Corporation, the B Corp. Has anyone heard of the B Corp? Has anyone not heard of the B Corp? All right, so there are different concepts right now brewing in states about how we create more socially responsive companies. Companies that aren't just beholden to the return on equity to their shareholders. But can a company actually care about the environment, care about its employees, potentially a little bit balancing out against the needs of their shareholders? You know, if a company doesn't do what's in their shareholders' best interest, they can get sued for in a shareholder derivative action for breaching their duty to their shareholders. Unless you have something in a chart that says not just shareholder return on equity is important to us, but the environment is important to us. These other important societal values. And to some extent, some of them deal with openness, but you can be a B Corp. You can satisfy 60 of the 200 categories to become a B Corp without doing anything that demonstrates any degree of openness. So for me, it comes down to I like the idea that the internet can be a place of transparency and openness, and we're no longer dealing with corporations inside black boxes. But we don't quite know which of the corporations that are open and which of the corporations that are not open. So I want some sort of good housekeeping seal of approval, like an OCOR seal on any company that has agreed to satisfy X, Y, and Z criteria and has sufficiently opened up its books for public scrutiny, has sufficiently released some of its IP through Creative Commons or open source or GNU licensing, some degree, and I don't quite know all the parameters, all of the rubric there, to determine what is in fact an open corporation. But to me, that's sort of a next positive step in the evolution of corporations and their degree of responsibility towards the consumers and the public. But that seems to apply to almost every single concept that Nate has fleshed out here. So I don't know if Open Core is the right starting point, or if it diverts us from the broader mission or other perhaps more noble missions, objectives there. I want to see us ultimately do all of this. But for me, I don't want us to lose sight of the goal of the positive virtue of openness in corporate
Jonathan,
behavior.
if I can just break in at this point and talk a little bit about B corporations and benefit corporations. There is a brand new statute in New York that became effective in February. It was actually passed unanimously by the legislature that created benefit corporations. And for those of you who don't know what they are exactly as Jonathan said, an addition to our existing array of corporate possibilities that allows a company effectively to bake a social mission into its certificate of incorporation. It can, and it not only can, it in fact, it must. It must indicate which areas of social concern, whether they be environmental, whether they be that of openness, whether they be that of sustainability, whether it be supply chain sustainability, whether it be employee relations. They get to put that into their certificate of incorporation and say, effectively, in addition to maximizing value to shareholders, this is important to us. From a transparency perspective, what is required of new benefit corporations is that they have effectively an annual report on how well they have done in their social mission, which must by statute be located on their website. Now this is of course looking somewhat into the future because this is only a relatively new type of entity. But the other thing that entities of all sizes, shapes, and colors can do, regardless of their jurisdiction, regardless of their formation as a corporation, limited liability company, sole proprietorship, or otherwise, is they can be certified as B corporations by B Laboratory. B Laboratory, and this is what Jonathan was referring to before, B Laboratory is a not-for-profit entity based out of Philadelphia. There's another entity based out of California that does this type of certification as well. I don't recall their name. In which a company that wishes to have B Lab certification goes through a process in which it discloses all sorts of information about its use of carbon and carbon offsets, and its employee policies, and its charity policies, and everything else. And there are a series of about 200 questions. If you score above a certain point, they'll interview you for about an hour, hour and a half. If you pass the interview, then you'll provide backup for this. It's really quite a validated process, or quite a substantiated process of validation, I should say. And then you get to use the BLIP certification on your website and elsewhere in your business. So you're certified as a B corporation, that you exist for benefit, for social benefit purposes. I think what Jonathan is getting at is, I think the point that he made beforehand is that their criteria are rather broad. They've got their set of criteria. And what you're talking about is a particular set of transparency criteria, as Nate was trying to get at as well. And the transparency criteria are included in BLab's access tool, but they're certainly not central. There's no doubt that they're not central. They're one of many, and in fact, they're probably one of the smaller of the many. There was a gentleman in the back had a question?
Just about the B corporations, I'm new to the concept. So besides the benefit of like a reputational thing, and also the not being somewhat insulated from shareholders having like, pure power over profit or nothing, are there any economic advantage or any tax incentives to being a B Corp?
No tax incentives. It's more like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval for CSR. I think the people who elect BLab certification do so because that's the space in which they're really acting, and they want to be able to say, hey, look at me, I'm really quite responsible too. And BLabs range in size, or B Corps I should say, range in size from single person shops to companies like Patagonia, the outerwear manufacturer.
Is there any extra cost involved
in creating a benefit corporation? The answer is no, not directly. If you are a benefit corporation under New York state law, you must also become BLab certified or be certified by this other entity. BLab itself charges a certification fee based upon the size of the company and the size of its revenues. So there is some cost to BLab certification, but it varies with the size of the company. Sorry.
So is the idea, or one possible idea of making this work is something like the BLab thing, but just more focused on these key principles?
Yeah. So maybe we should have started this conversation sort of backwards, but my thought was on ending with what does the framework look like? How do we enforce this kind of thing? Was that there are multiple ways that this could be incorporated into a business's practice, right? They could adopt this as an internal policy. They could put this as something in their corporate bylaw without necessarily going through the benefit corporation route, or they could become a benefit corporation through either BLabs or some other certification body that adopted a standard like this that really focused on transparency and use of product, which is not something that typically these certification bodies look at. Typically what they look at is what's the company's impact, or how do they treat their employees, and it's very much sort of like about the corporation. It's not about the people who use their products. And I think that was where I thought there was a real hole, a real gap in the attention of the world to issues of social responsibility, because Google might use, or Facebook might use, 63% of their power from green sources. They may have a great GLBT policy within their hiring practices and benefits, but when it comes to curtailing free speech or deletion of user data, or not allowing a user to delete their own data from their account, those are real. If Facebook were a country, those would be violations of the ICCPR. And so how can we craft something that looks like a good policy? And then finally, how do we incorporate it? Is it through charter revision or something like that?
I think one good way of getting it started is, right now the problem with like Google or any other existing company is just inertia and having them change the way they do things. But if you focus on startups and with the new crowdfunding, craze that should hopefully take off. If you get a lot of startups to incorporate this from the ground up, that might be the best way to show off what it would mean to, because it all comes down to consumer demanding.
Right.
And
Although, don't we need some frame of reference, some compare and contrast points? Was anyone here an hour ago for the PriView discussion? So here's what I keep, and I didn't see the PriView discussion today, but I know what PriView is up to. Is there a way to take something along the PriView rating model and apply it more broadly in this context? Can we, so for those of you who missed PriView, they want a rating system to rate, they want to develop a crowdsourced rating capability to rate how much a website, a company sanctifies the user's privacy. So could we create something along the lines of a seal of approval in all of these other realms? We could have a civil liberties stamp if you satisfy whatever rubric we determine is civil liberty, meets the threshold requirement, the 80% test for, you sanctify civil liberties. You meet the 80% test for satisfying environment. And companies can have, we can have 20 criteria. I don't know how many you had on your list, but we can have, so Google satisfies it in environmental. It satisfies it in employee treatment. It satisfies it in lesbian, gay activity. It fails in civil liberties, or I don't know what. It fails in international human rights or worker issues. Yeah.
What are the consequences if the company incorporates on the B terms and follow the terms? What are the consequences?
If it violates the terms, they can have their B status revoked and they become an ordinary business corporation.
There's no economic consequences, like fines?
Fines? I don't believe so. And I know one thing is for sure, there's no private right of action against a benefit corporation for not going this way as opposed to that way.
So here's what I think we're going to see, and it's true, every time, all of my sort of corporate law mentors, whenever we get a company in and we try to move them into a B Corp or a flexible purpose Corp or an L3C, any of the hybrid socially responsible corporate types, my mentors always say, it's stupid, don't do it, company can behave that way anyway, all you're doing is hamstringing them unnecessarily. And you look at a company like Ben & Jerry's, sold to Unilever and had to give up its commitment to social responsibility.
That was the origins of benefit corporation.
Yeah. If Ben & Jerry's was a benefit corporation, Unilever would have had to adhere to the terms that Ben & Jerry's adhered to in its corporate charter. So, but I think that there's going to be a whole new host of benefactors, responsible venture capitalists, responsible angel investors, who are going to want to take at least a portion of their portfolio and put them into these socially responsible enterprises. So while there may not be economic consequences now, there may be economic consequences down the line.
And there certainly is a large, I work a lot with this, social enterprise community, and there are very specific, funds being set up for socially responsible enterprises. There's a lot of investors who are very excited about this, and they know that their return is going to be low, but they're excited about doing it because that's what they want to do. They want to have an impact.
Well, so just my views on this, since a while ago I had a pretty vigorous debate with actually fellow attendee here on this. So it's that his argument was, all right, so if you do the sports sector, so the social enterprise type of hybrid organization, his argument was, why not just do a non-profit? And we had a pretty vigorous debate on this issue, so just had to, for example, so what are really your views? So my points were really on the issue of financial sustainability and those.
Well, I can answer that question. I think that there are reasons to do social benefit rather than nonprofit. First of all, the IRS doesn't like it when a nonprofit behaves like a private corporation, selling widgets, for instance, or doing other private business sort of activities. So it's very hard to maintain a private business status unless you have a very clear charitable objective, and the vast majority of your activities are directed at that. So the benefit corporation is a way for companies to get into a slightly different business model that's more private sector oriented, but without giving up their social impact potential. The short answer, that's the short answer. The other answer is, I don't think that this matters, whether or not these kinds of policies should be in a nonprofit or for-profit or benefit corporation. I think these are the policies that we should be advocating for in all business, because I think that these are all grounded in fundamental human rights.
If I can just pick up on what Nate is saying, his point is absolutely correct. It does not matter whether you're talking about an ordinary corporation, a not-for-profit corporation, a benefit corporation, an L3C, or an LLC. None of this will be applicable until such time as there becomes some level of voluntary compliance, some buy-in that's based upon the notion that ultimately this is going to be to your benefit.
Right, it's just that his skepticism was really on the worst of both worlds, getting the worst of for-profit and worst of non-profit.
It really isn't. I mean, if you take a look, for example, if you look at BLab's website, they have a number of they have some video on there from the gentleman who founded Patagonia and one of the other fairly large entities that belongs to it. And they say to themselves effectively, look, this is our way of taking not just what we do, but ensuring that this is going to happen throughout the generations. And as I was saying before, Ben & Jerry's had this great funky little ice cream company in Vermont. And they went public. They did the first intrastate public offering, intrastate only public offering. They offered it only to Vermont residents in something like 50-something years. But as a public company, their shareholder base expanded. And when all of a sudden they were faced with an unintended, or an undesired, I should say, offer to buy them, they had no choice. They were legally constrained to maximize shareholder value only. The benefit corporation structure allows someone who has created a business and operated in a particular way to say, not only am I doing this now, but I'm ensuring that any future shareholders and any future stewards of this corporation are going to be bound by this and have the same vision. Yes,
Gentleman back.
I think this is huge. I think this is akin to what happened with the SEC and 10Ks and actually making things transparent. So I think that what you have is an opportunity to set a base standard of these are the base requirements to be a B Corp. But then what one gentleman suggested, which is if you tied it to Kickstarter and got Kickstarter to have a checkoff where people say, I am a B Corp, that's a huge opportunity to get people off the base. Also eBay, where people can get the B Corp badge, and then and that's where I was about to head in terms of what Professor Askin was saying in terms of we're growing up now in a badge world of Foursquare where if I check in a place enough times I'm mayor, or if I check in at the same time as everyone else, I can be part of the tsunami badge or whatever. But what you might want to consider is working with other industries. So I'm in politics. There's a group called CAPS that's run by Public Advocates de Blasio that's forcing companies to be transparent about their campaign spending. Because in a post-Citizens United world, I run a company. That company, we spent $300,000 taking out a state senator because he was corrupt. Can we do this? Yes. Do I have to disclose it? No. Should I? Probably. I only have one, it's a sole member venture capital fund, so I think my sole member is okay with where his money's going. But the point is that there need to be transparency standards, so what you might be able to do is partner with a group like CAPS to say, what are your standards, and let's have 3 different badges for that, and then let's work with the companies who want that badge and tell them that if they want this badge, they have to become a B Corp, and this is one badge they can get. And then in terms of what likely partners in the marketplace, I'm running for office. Everything I do has to have a union bug on it, because otherwise the unions won't support me. So if there's a B Corp and they pledge to have union support, then they get a union badge. And then in terms of it, on the B Corp website, there's a limited list of Meet the B Corps, but if there was a marketplace kind of like what Creative Commons did with Larry Lessig's initiative, where you can find all the people releasing things in that, it creates a kind of a model where you can look at what the Better Business Bureau does, which is a great model. I run a number of corporations where the Better Business Bureau comes knocking and twists my arm into being a participant. And then you can look at what some of the other groups are doing around transparency and just model on that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Lessig, because Lessig said he was going to try to come here. He spoke at Transparency Camp in DC this weekend. So he's in fact speaking about these very issues.
So I think what I'm hearing from everybody is that what we really want to do is kind of leverage these shifting social and cultural norms that we're seeing across the board with just people, you know, like the sort of badging thing, and like this idea that, you know, people respond really well to these kinds of seals of approval and gold stars. And we saw it at EFF, there was the Who Has Your Back campaign, which was just in Silicon Valley, right? But which, I mean, suddenly these companies wanted these gold stars. Gold star didn't mean anything, it just meant a gold star on a website, but they really wanted them, like you know, that people worked like that. And I think it's a really good idea and a really useful insight to talk about leveraging that tendency that people have to protect and defend human rights. But I think it's a mistake to conflate that with law, because that's not law per se. And maybe it shouldn't be, and maybe it can't be. And I think one of the important things to point out even about the ICCPR is that it's not binding. The ICCPR is a codification of norms, and we're talking about norms, and I think that that's all really valuable. But I think that, I also think that it's important to talk about liability and corporate liability for things like human rights abuses. I think that's something that the tech world and the human rights advocacy world are both really, really focused on and should work together on. But I think that encouraging the kind of more general defense of human rights is something that you're going to be doing by incentivizing people in ways that technology can make easier, but that aren't specifically legal.
Yeah, and I think that was my sort of, the reason I laid out the presentation the way that I did was because I think that you talk about the ICCPR not being sort of law in the sense that, you know, the same sort of like speeding trip, you know, law in New York, and you can't get pulled over for, you know.
Right.
So I agree, but that's why I took them out, those things out as principles, and then talked about them really as principles, and then sort of toward the end, we talk about how does that get enforced, and is it through some kind of legal, you know, option like a benefit corporation, which I think is a great way of codifying it, in not codifying it in strict sense, but you know, it's actually putting it into a specific corporate form that only exists if people have that, or do we let that be a set of principles that companies can adopt without necessarily becoming benefit corporations?
Right, I see three levels of this, of ways of approaching this. One is top-down, government-imposed, be that America, every other country, whatever, with 220 distinct approaches to all of those disparate issues. Actually, four. Right, so government-sanctioned treaties, government-specific rules, statutes, regulations. Then the middle tier is industry-based solutions, in part perhaps out of fear of government intercession, and in part out of fear of consumer backlash. That's the middle layer, and that's essentially what the accountants did when they came up with generally accepted accounting principles. They were desperately afraid of government intercession. They came up with industry-based standards that they would adhere to without government intercession. And then there's a third path, which may make the most sense, because, and to me that's bottom up. That's consumer-driven ratings of companies. And that is the wisdom of the crowd and the community saying, we think this is the right rubric, and we think this company is good at that, and this company is good at the other thing, and this is the you know, these are the 12 checklist items, and this is how this company does on the various items. And if you care about civil rights, but you don't necessarily care about, you know, employee rights or something, then you're fine with that company, but you might not be fine with another company.
And that's a market-based solution where there needs to be some kind of, like she was saying, you know, some kind of way of distinguishing those companies from the ones that don't, and therefore, you know, giving the consumer the option to actually make that choice.
So when I did the Global IP Alliance 8 years ago, 9, whatever, that was completely at that middle level. That was supposed to be existing and emerging companies agreeing to a set of a memorandum of understanding, the best practices across the globe. These are how good actors will behave in the new internet world. That was because we weren't quite at the Web 2.0 the ability of the crowd to participate. Now that we're there, my inclination is to move it down to the consumer rating model, as opposed to building coalitions at the responsible corporate level. And I want to know what people think about that. I'm happy if we as a community try to work both tiers of that. I mean, I'd say forget about the treaties and forget about the government-imposed top-down approach. But if we could do things to create tools for various consumer groups to sanctify these as, you know, whatever the equivalent of B Corp is in the environment and in, you know, in civil liberties, et cetera, I'd like to see it at the grassroots level, I think.
I wonder if we're not talking about a chicken and egg issue here, though, on the one hand, because unless these companies make sufficient disclosure as to what their policies are, how are people going to be able to rate them on this other than, gee, I bought this from Radio Shack and it broke?
Right.
So,
well, the default is until they open up their books, they can't get a good grade.
They get
yeah.
big red X.
I think that
Tell them who you are and what you do.
Yeah, okay. My name's Malcolm Arnold. I founded Ruby Newbie, and what we do is we teach the latest web development technologies currently for free at NYU to those who help us sponsor in some way or mentor low-income youth or help us with our mission. We learn those skills alongside each other, then later on we'll actually have startup competitions where we fund the starting of the businesses together. That's the first domino in a step to actually show that how we actually get to world peace as far as nuclear disarmament, etc. But I think that these issues, they're going about it, but they're not getting into the core issues of why we go to warfare as a military intelligence officer. What are the core problems of what faces our planet today? And I think that Thomas Jefferson said that governments are inherently corrupt. And as I presented at technology conferences, I posit that large transnational corporations are inherently more corrupt. Not that I have anything wrong with true form of capitalism, but there's no check and balance for large transnational corporations. And so,
in Europe,
what's that?
In Europe, where the people are more scared of the corporations than they are of the government.
Right. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to come up with a system that creates a check and balance for large transnational corporations or for corporate behavior. And that check and balance needs to be able to operate across national boundaries. And if you look at warfare, what are the reasons that we truly go to warfare? It doesn't make sense for me to go to war with you. It doesn't make sense for you to go to war with me. But my country goes to war with your country, and whether we're both against the war, we still suffer the consequences. So it's in the interest of some people. And what are those points that you attack? And you have to look at those leverage points. I think the best way of going about this is creating a new corporate structure, which is akin to a global trust, a global guild. And that global trust operates across national boundaries. So if there is no check and balance against large transnational corporations, one thing I learned from military intelligence is that you combat fire with fire, in counterintelligence, you use their techniques against them. So you create a global trust that's a for-profit that actually uses the techniques of that, but then all the profits get reinvested back into the community, and you can have multiple ones of these trusts. The leadership of those trusts then can be voted out by the people that are part of the trust. And so the trust is controlled by people who are educated, who really know the issues, but they have no power over the people, because then they can pick up their marbles anytime that they want to and then go to another global trust. They can pick up and form a new one. So they don't ever have, they're basically, the organization is supposed to be an enabler and have no real power over people.
Did you read Jailbird? It sounds like Vonnegut Ramjack Corporation.
No, I didn't.
Read Jailbird.
Jailbird?
Jailbird. Written a long time ago, but
okay.
It turns out Ramjack Corporation is run by a little old lady who actually gets all the world's money and then redistributes it to the people. I think so. It's global communism.
Actually, spoiler alert.
So that's the conclusion of the book.
Yeah. So did you have a question?
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of having some set of international standards, and I even like the idea of badges that identify, that we can start to kind of incorporate and identify with as we're choosing which service providers to use as consumers. But what I'm most drawn to when you're talking about protecting individuals and protecting human beings is transparency. I don't think that most people understand how data can be accessed and used against them. And I want to steer clear of creating legislation that tries to prevent the worst case scenarios and focuses on the most nefarious players. But I do want, I guess I want to see a couple of tiers. I want to see a tier of socially responsible leaders who understand how data can be used and how data is accessed within corporations or within companies. And I want specifically to know that if an individual has access to my specific information, unmasked information, I want to know that I can actually call for information about who did have access to my information, similar to the way that we now have access to government information about ourselves.
So a Freedom of Information Act for
Exactly.
private corporations.
Right.
It's an interesting angle. All right, that's something I hadn't thought about, but I actually love it. And I want to put my own goggles on it. It sounds like you're saying two things to me. It sounds like you're saying before we can deal with the whole host of issues that Nate has laid out on the table, we've got to deal with, first of all, corporate transparency, and secondarily, easier easier access to information. To your own
Corporate
information.
transparency
And privacy.
and access to information, and I guess education about what, I mean, I can have all the data in front of me in the world, but, you know, my
Right, and that's
grandmother
my
doesn't know
one.
what
I mean, I
that
love
means.
transparency. I love transparency. I think it's really important. I think it's a cornerstone for a policy like this. My issue with transparency is that it doesn't matter what kind of warning labels you put on things. People still smoke, you know, and people
Right.
still use Google, and you know, and so there's a certain limit to transparency because people become overwhelmed with the information, or they don't know how to interpret the information, often because it's written in non-plain language. And so my hope is that on top of the transparency protections, we can also build other ways which specifically limit a company from using their data, regardless of whether you know about it or not, or whether you read that provision or not. I'm curious, is there anybody in the room who actually works for a private company with a digital product? What's your opinion of this?
My opinion?
Yeah.
So I work.
Tell me about what your company is.
I work for a practical law company. We're kind of like a LexisNexis, but for transactional attorneys. So most of our clients.
We get it.
What?
We get it here.
Yeah. I love trying to explain that to people who don't know what that is, and whatever, it gets complicated.
We get it for free. I don't know what you charge the outside world.
Yeah, so it's great. I love the product. What I do is a bit boring, but we're not like collecting. I mean, the data we're collecting is more on like who clicks on what articles. And we actually, like the internal data, we can see individuals at law firms and what they like the most. But it's hard, from my perspective, it's not like, I mean, the data we're collecting, I don't think we're using it nefariously. But and I assume a lot of companies like Google can make that same claim. Like, we're just trying to serve you better ads. Like, we're just trying to create better products. Oh, they like this credit agreement, let's do more of those.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's easy for companies to kind of make that argument. And so it'd be harder to really pinpoint as to why that's bad. Now, if we're selling your data to spammers or something like that, that's pretty obvious. But I don't think we're doing that.
Right, but do you have a corporate policy, for instance, in place that specifically says that you're not going to discriminate on the basis of national origin access to your services?
Well, our product is, I mean, we have a UK product, a US product, and I mean, that's about it. Because we're focusing on laws, it doesn't really help that much to, you know, sell our product abroad unless they're dealing with kind of US corporations.
Right.
So it's not.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this isn't a great analogy. I mean,
Yeah.
Is there anybody else who sort of has a thought on like why a private company might or might not want to adopt this kind of a policy?
So when it still existed, I used to work for DoubleClick. So we were the big bad.
You were bad before Google.
We were, yeah, well, I worked there right when we got acquired by Google. That's another story.
But you got this great basketball courts.
Yes. So the reason why I raised my hand is because I worked with the guys developing the products that do all this data collection. And privacy and transparency were jokes. And that's something that we should take into consideration, because no matter, and I had many, many conversations about, come on, look at what we're doing, look at the implications. And they were still jokes. There was absolutely no respect, no consideration for privacy issues. And the poor guys that had the privacy policy enforcing jobs were just, they had a rough life. So it comes right back to the question of enforcement, and I really don't have, even though there are a lot of jobs open for people with privacy expertise, I really don't see a big future for that unless we do it from grassroots up, because there's no incentive. Their entire business model is based on access to your information and dissemination of it to the highest bidder. And that's just the way the internet is structured.
And I don't think that inherently is evil. I mean, I also don't think it's possible to stop it at this point. I think my approach is to, my question really is, what kind of protections can we put in place, and how can we put them into place to have some kind of limits on that, and try and bracket that a little bit. And I like the idea of having a certification. I like the idea of starting, where did that idea come from? Starting with small companies. Because that's really the movement that I would like to build, is working with social entrepreneurs who are starting companies now, so that they're not thinking about this issue when they've made their first $1 billion or when they IPO, and then they say, God, how did we get here? It wasn't so great. Maybe we can kind of go back and fix things. I want them thinking about that the whole way through, and that's why I'd like them to adopt a policy like this from the beginning, so that by the time they get to be a $1 billion company, they're not an example of how to make money and then go back and fix the things you did wrong, but an example of how you can make $1 billion and still do good things.
I don't know. I think it's about, you were talking about incentives, and it seems to me like beyond reputational, it's a big risk for some of these companies to open themselves up to something in this manner. And I think a lot of people have they want to do the social good, but then when they really when they really break it down to risk reward, the reward's not big enough on something like this, and it's structure. So I'm trying, and they all respond to the economic end of it. So I wonder, maybe a network in which B corporations have some sort of discount or something if you're within the consortium or something. And that's why I asked about the tax incentive, because why would you form a B Corp over a C Corp if you're just gonna have to work but you don't get any money?
If I can pick up on that for just a moment, there's an entity called the Social Venture Network, which is a private organization or alliance of socially conscious businesses, not necessarily B Corps, so they're certainly very big supporters. And they collaboratively, of their own accord, have programs where they offer significant discounts on their products to other members. So at a minimum, they're gaining some traction with each other and some scale within the organization. Then presumably as the organization scales, that will bring things up as well.
I know you've had a question for a long time. I'll take one more question, because I know that we're probably standing between people and beer, which is not a good place to stand. I'll let you answer your question. I'll ask your question.
I just got the impression, I support a good intent, but I'm wary of the misuse of the good intent in the implementation of the B corporation. For the scenario where, like, I'm a for-profit corporation and I'm running a company, I would just use the B corporation to write the PR benefits, and I would invoke the defense in litigations that where I was in a business transaction, I make some business decisions that earn less profit, and in a back end deals I get like a benefit, like kickbacks, and my investor got wind of that and I sued, and I probably would invoke that for the benefit that there's less trees being cut or less environment being destroyed.
It doesn't really work that way. With BLIP, they have the right to audit you spontaneously every 2 years, and when they audit you,
Who audits?
BLIP itself. They take a look through your books and records. And of course, it's always possible to describe.
But there's no consequence if you violate.
Well, if you're, first of all, as a benefit corporation in New York, you must be certified. BLIP will decertify you, and you will lose your benefit corporation status. In addition, whether there could exist a cause of action for you held yourself out as a benefit corporation when in reality you weren't functioning as one. I don't know of any cases in the 6 other jurisdictions where that happens. Most people who want to engage in less than savory activity will stick with for-profit corporations. They won't move to a benefit corporation.
But you see as an eventuality that somebody may invoke that as a defense.
I don't think so. I really don't see that.
We've got to wrap up now so we can go up to see the hacks and drink a little bit. A couple things I want to say. First of all, it's the windows are open upstairs, so I think it's going to be cooler. That's my hope. Second, I don't want us to lose momentum on this. I know that this stuff is going to happen. It's just a matter of whether it happens in a year or 40 years. My hope is that it happens in a year. My hope is that we in this room are part of the process. So I don't want to lose momentum. And frankly, Nate, if you have thoughts on how we continue momentum, next steps, I would love if this congealed around Goodnik and you did a follow-up event where we hash this out. So maybe I'll give you the party.
Okay. So I think this is, I've put together some thoughts and ideas, and I know that you guys have probably got some thoughts and ideas as well. I have a larger sort of Goodnik code of conduct that I put together that includes environmental, labor, other issues like that. This was really just the digital portion. What I'm going to be doing is posting this code of conduct on Docracy, and I'm going to look to people for input on that and get edits, and we're going to treat it like a collaborative document. What is realistic? What can we do? What kind of policy should we have? Are all of these absurd, or all of these need to be fleshed out? Some are more important than others. And through Docracy, I hope that we'll quickly arrive at a code of conduct that I think that will be the standard for digital product companies, in the future. And then we can, by doing that, maybe what we can do is then have a constitutional convention of some sort with participants who can really, put the final stamp on this and say, we the people, this is what we want from digital companies, and this is how we want you to run your business.
And Repeal Citizens United?
Yeah, right. Among other. So if you're interested in doing that, if you're interested in participating in that process, my email is nate@goodnik.org. Shoot me an email. We'll figure out the Docracy thing. I only kind of caught on to it this morning with the keynote presentation. So, but if you're interested, please email me, nate@goodnik.org, and sign up for my newsletter at goodnik.org.
Don't you also have the meetup group? Or?
What's that?
Does you also have the meetup group?
Yeah, I do have a meetup group as well. We do technology seminars for nonprofit organizations and social entrepreneurs on a semi-weekly basis, so that's the other side of things. But yeah.
I just want to take one last moment and thank Professor Jonathan Askin for asking me to be a panelist here today. It's particularly fitting that it was in this very room, in the seat where that gentleman in the blue shirt, not you with the tie, the one behind you, was sitting, that I had my first class here at Brooklyn Law School 32 years ago. So when Jonathan started mentioning 30, 40 years to get something done, I started thinking about the depth of the length of time that it had been since I first came here. And so I thank him for giving me the opportunity. It only took me 32 years to get to the front of the room.
Well, we're going to have you back. There is, and we're reinitiating something called the Future Plus 30, actually. This is an event where we actually take a concept and we imagine what it's going to look like in 30 years. It ran for a few years, and the guy was bought by Facebook, so we lost it. We're going to restart it. Speaking of, that's the life, that's the generation. What happens a generation from now? All right, so thanks, folks. Let's go upstairs and drink.
You're based here, or?
Yeah.